In every generation, there comes a moment when the system begins to crack. When the numbers don't add up. When the promises no longer hold. For decades, the world trusted the dollar, a symbol of power, stability, and control. But behind every transaction, every trade, every debt, something was shifting. The cracks were small at first. A market crash here, a bank collapse there. But soon, the foundation itself began to tremble. What happens when the world's most powerful currency starts to lose its grip? When nations begin to rise against a system that once ruled them all?
Grenade! Hush!
We want justice!
From Wall Street to Shanghai, from Moscow to Sao Paulo, a new order is forming. One built not on trust, but on necessity. This is the story of how it all began. The downfall of the dollar. The birth of a new era. An era where money no longer guarantees freedom, and freedom must be earned back, one choice at a time. Welcome to the turning point. The moment everything changes. In every cycle of prosperity, there comes a reckoning. For decades, America believed its economic might was unshakable, a beacon of endless consumption, global dominance, and the illusion of wealth. But beneath that facade, the seeds of collapse were quietly taking root. This, some economists warned, was inevitable. Not through foreign sabotage or global betrayal, but self-inflicted. The nation pricked its own bubble, and now the air is rushing out. For years, the warning signs were there. Trade deficits ballooned, manufacturing hollowed out, and debt became the lifeblood of an economy addicted to spending beyond its means. Yet when the crisis finally came, many looked outward for someone to blame. Donald Trump, observing the mounting trade imbalances, believed the deficits themselves were the enemy. Evidence, he thought, of foreign nations cheating America. But the truth ran deeper. The trade deficits weren't the disease, they were the symptom. The real problem was within. For decades, Americans had lived beyond their means, consuming far more than they produced, borrowing more than they could repay. The illusion of prosperity was propped up by foreign capital, by other nations buying US assets, manufacturing its goods, and lending it the money to maintain an unsustainable lifestyle. It was a fragile system, but it worked, for a while. The US enjoyed low interest rates, cheap goods, and inflated stock markets. Americans appeared richer on paper, their assets soaring even as real productivity stagnated. It was a comfortable lie, until someone tried to end it. Trump's crusade to fix global trade was meant to restore balance. But in doing so, he disrupted the very mechanism that had allowed the United States to live beyond its means. The result was predictable. Rising prices, rising rates, falling markets, and the beginning of a painful reckoning. If foreign nations stopped buying American debt and goods, the consequences were inevitable. Interest rates would soar, prices would climb, and the standard of living, once artificially elevated, would fall sharply. That, economists warned, was not ruin. It was liberation. A forced return to reality. For the first time in generations, Americans would have to live within their means, to save more, spend less, and rebuild the productive foundation that had long eroded beneath them. And as the US faced the coming storm, one asset, ancient, immutable, and scorned by modern investors, began to rise again. Gold. In just 3 days, its price surged by over $250. What began as a quiet correction turned into a stampede. Foreign central banks, long dismissed as old-fashioned, were quietly hoarding the metal, not out of nostalgia, but preparation. They were unloading dollars, the world's reserve currency, in anticipation of a new order. A world where the dollar would no longer reign supreme. A world where gold, once again, would anchor value. As digital assets like Bitcoin dominated headlines, the real money, the kind that could not be printed, censored, or defaulted on, was flowing elsewhere. The central banks of China, Russia, and others weren't chasing speculation. They were preparing for the fall of an empire built on debt. And this, analysts warned, was only the beginning. The cracks were spreading faster than anyone expected. Markets that once felt invincible began trembling under the weight of uncertainty. For years, investors had believed in one simple rule, that the Federal Reserve could always rescue them. But this time, the Fed's tools were no longer magic. Printing money had become a national habit, a reflex every time panic struck. But like any addiction, it came with withdrawal. Decades of stimulus, bailouts, and artificially low interest rates had turned the economy into a fragile machine, one that depended on endless debt to keep running. When inflation surged, it exposed the truth. The system wasn't built to withstand reality. As the cost of living soared, families struggled, savings eroded, and confidence faded. The stock market, once a symbol of strength, became a mirror reflecting fear. Foreign investors, who once financed America's spending by buying its debt, began quietly backing away. China reduced its US Treasury holdings. Nations in the Middle East shifted reserves into gold. Even longtime allies in Europe began questioning the dollar's dominance. It was subtle at first, a slow leak in the financial system. But to those watching closely, it was a signal that faith in the dollar was beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, the American government was still spending like the good times never ended. Trillions poured into programs, wars, and bailouts, all funded by money it didn't have. Every dollar borrowed had to come from somewhere, and fewer countries were willing to lend. This forced the Federal Reserve into an impossible position: raise interest rates and risk a full-blown recession, keep them low, and watch inflation spiral out of control. Either path led to pain. The middle class, once the backbone of the American dream, was being squeezed from both ends. Wages couldn't keep up with prices. Rent, food, healthcare, everything cost more. Yet political leaders insisted the economy was strong. But strength built on debt is an illusion, and illusions eventually collapse. That's when something remarkable began to happen. While Wall Street obsessed over quarterly profits, ordinary people started waking up. They began asking the questions no one wanted to answer. What happens when the dollar is no longer trusted? What happens when debt becomes unpayable? And the answers pointed to a sobering truth, that every empire built on borrowed money eventually falls. History had shown this before. From Rome to Britain, great powers had collapsed not from invasion, but from financial decay. When the money lost value, everything else followed: the institutions, the trade, the power. America, it seemed, was approaching that same crossroads. And just like those fallen empires, it was facing the same impossible question: can a nation addicted to debt ever truly recover without destruction? Economists argued, politicians blamed, but the markets didn't wait. Gold continued to surge, the dollar weakened, and whispers began circulating about a new world financial system, one no longer anchored by Washington, but by a coalition of nations seeking independence from the US. They called it de-dollarization, the gradual move away from the American currency as the center of global trade. To some, it sounded like paranoia. But in the halls of power in Beijing, Moscow, and Riyadh, it was already becoming policy. And as this quiet revolution unfolded, one thing became clear: the global financial order, the same one that had ruled for nearly a century, was beginning to fracture. The question wasn't if it would break. The question was when. The warning signs were everywhere, yet few wanted to believe them. The media spoke of temporary turbulence, politicians promised recovery, and investors clung to optimism. But beneath the surface, the system was quietly reconfiguring itself. Across the world, nations were preparing for a financial shift, unlike any seen in modern history. The BRICS alliance, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, began expanding its economic vision. Their goal was simple: build a parallel system where trade could thrive without the US dollar. They were done playing by Washington's rules. And for the first time in decades, America's financial dominance faced a genuine rival. Russia, cut off from Western banking after sanctions, started selling oil in rubles. China began settling trade in yuan. Even nations once dependent on American aid began experimenting with alternative currencies. To the average citizen, it felt distant, abstract even. But behind every small policy change, a quiet revolution was taking place. The world was learning to live without the dollar. Inside the United States, the mood was shifting too. As inflation persisted, and layoffs grew. Frustration turned into anger. The promise of endless prosperity had turned hollow. Families were watching their savings vanish, their retirements crumble, their homes fall into foreclosure. The American dream, once a global symbol of hope, was becoming harder to reach. Meanwhile, the government's answer was always the same: print more money, raise the ceiling, borrow again. Each rescue came at the cost of tomorrow's stability. Each temporary solution dug the nation deeper into a pit it could no longer climb out of. Financial analysts warned that America's debt trajectory was unsustainable. The numbers simply didn't add up anymore. The interest alone on the national debt was now consuming a historic portion of the federal budget, and still rising. But the real danger wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the mindset, the belief that the system was too big to fail. Throughout history, that same arrogance had destroyed nations. Empires always believed their power was eternal, until it wasn't. The Roman denarius, once backed by silver, became worthless. The British pound, once the global reserve currency, surrendered its crown. And now, the US dollar was walking that same path. In boardrooms and think tanks, quiet discussions began. Could digital currencies replace the dollar as the foundation of global trade? Could blockchain systems or central bank digital tokens build a new kind of financial order? Faster, borderless, and immune to manipulation. Some saw it as innovation. Others saw it as control. Because with every digital transaction, every traceable coin, the idea of privat, the freedom once guaranteed by cash, began to disappear. As governments pushed for digital currency systems, critics warned that such technology could be used to monitor, restrict, or even erase individual financial freedom. A cashless society meant convenience, yes, but it also meant dependency on systems that could be turned off with a single command. And that realization sparked something powerful. From small towns to online communities, a counter-movement began to rise. Ordinary people turning to decentralized systems like Bitcoin and gold as modern acts of resistance. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about sovereignty. They weren't trying to get rich. They were trying to stay free. And as this financial awakening spread, it became clear. The next global conflict might not be fought with armies and weapons, but with currencies, data, and control over who gets to spend and who doesn't. As the tides of change swept across nations, the world stood at a crossroads. The old order was crumbling, not with the sound of war, but with the quiet unraveling of trust. For decades, people had believed in the same promise, that their savings were safe, their currency stable, and their governments in control. But now, those certainties were fading. Across the cities once bustling with ambition, a new silence had settled. Empty office towers glowed through the night, symbols of an age that had pushed too far, too fast. The wealth gap widened until it split society in two. Those at the top found new ways to profit from chaos, while those at the bottom learned to survive in it. But history has always shown that when systems collapse, humanity finds a way to rebuild, stronger, smarter, and more aware, and that rebuilding had already begun. Independent economies emerged. Communities that traded in local currencies, digital tokens, or even direct barter systems. People began taking control of their own value, no longer waiting for permission from institutions that had failed them. The concept of wealth itself began to shift, from paper and digits to resources, skills, and connections. Governments, too, were forced to adapt. The pressure of rising debt, social unrest, and global competition left them no choice but to evolve. Central banks began exploring transparent, blockchain-based systems. International alliances shifted focus from dominance to cooperation. Nations that once stood as rivals started finding common ground in survival. And in the middle of it all, one truth became impossible to ignore. Control over money had always been control over people. People were learning to take that control back. The dollar's supremacy didn't vanish overnight, but its era of unquestioned rule had ended. What came next wasn't a single currency or a single empire, but a fragmented, diverse, interconnected system shaped by billions of human choices. It was messy, unpredictable, and yet, perhaps, more free than anything that came before. In classrooms, young students began learning not just economics, but financial independence. In small towns, neighbors taught each other how to grow food, store value, and trade ethically. The digital and physical worlds blended in unexpected ways, giving rise to a new generation that no longer feared change, but embraced it. The financial collapse that once seemed like the end of civilization became, in time, a beginning. The moment humanity stopped worshipping systems and started believing in it again. Because history doesn't end with collapse. It restarts there. And so, as one chapter closed, another opened. Not of endless debt and dependency, but of awareness and resilience. A world where wealth is no longer dictated by those in power, but defined by those who create, build, and share. And as the dawn breaks on this new era, one question remains. What will we choose to build next?